Hollowbody released on September 12, 2024, after roughly 3 years of development and was made by one single person, Nathan Hamley. Nate, based out in the jolly old U of K, has made games before in the past, the most notable of which was Chasing Static, a mostly walking sim-styled horror game that gained a little bit of traction back in 2021. It wasn't anything huge or even close to the momentum that Hollowbody has now. I got Chasing Static back when it was released, and although I can't really say that I'm much of a fan of it, sadly. It's not very scary, and it relies far too heavily on my least favorite storytelling trope in video games, bar none, especially when it comes to a layered subtext story such as the one found in Chasing Static, which is having its story told in segments of just listening to people talk. What's interesting though is that Nathan decided to quite literally completely change up his game with Hollowbody, going from an incredibly methodical and slow-paced walking sim into a fixed camera-focused old-school survival horror game. Now, Hollowbody has been making the rounds among the YouTube Indian horror gaming circuits for the past couple years, but it's hit all new sorts of levels of attention due to its release. It's gotten pretty much near unanimous praise, saying it's a return to classic old-school survival horror and praising its dedication to the old-school craft. I started and finished Hollowbody in one go, and while I do agree that it is a very good video game, especially when put into the context of it being made by one person, I do want to at least try to be as honest as possible when it comes to this game. I was kindly given a copy of the game by Nate himself, and for that I am grateful, but I thought that some critiques towards his wonderful new indie darling wouldn't hurt. So here's the good and the bad of Hollowbody.
You look lonely. I can fix that.
Hollowbody looks and feels very old school. From the tank controls to the fixed cameras harkening back to the adjustable and dynamic fixed cameras of Silent Hill, there's no denying where Nate took his inspiration for Hollowbody. Parts of Hollowbody feel like a PS1 game made in the PS2 era but remastered for the modern day. With all of the focus that PS1 horror has been gaining recently, it is a nice refreshing change of pace that a PS2 style horror game is getting the spotlight. PS2 era horror aesthetic feels very different than a vast majority of the PS1 and N64 era did. It took a lot more risks, it tried a lot of new things, and started to break away from what the original Resident Evil and Silent Hill games had established as the horror genre norm. I'll come back to this later, but from limited ammo to clunky and stiff awkward combat, Hollowbody revels in this forgotten, or at the very least underrepresented era of horror games and gives it a much needed mechanical baseline that a lot of games from that era were missing. The presentation of this game's story is also a highlight, if not a little wishy-washy in my opinion. The funny thing is though, is that if you're not aware of Nate's previous game Chasing Static, or only know about it by Hollowbody's mere existence, you probably aren't aware that Hollowbody is actually technically a sequel to Chasing Static. The connections might be a little bit loose at first, but by the end of Hollowbody's prologue, you'll realize that there is at least some ties back to Chasing Static. It's been a while since I've played the game though, so I'm not really sure if the connections are deeper than I'm actually giving it credit for, but the seams are there to be connected, which is always a cool thing to discover. But the presentation of it and the bleakness of the game's ending were things that I found really well done and were right up my alley. The esoteric nature of its story at its best reminded me of Signalis, but at its worst felt like my least favorite parts about Chasing Static. Combat in the game is mostly good as well. I'll get to my issues with the combat later, but ranged combat is fluid, straightforward, and it still maintains that level of jank that you definitely want from a game like this. It feels just as you remember those old games feeling, but you wouldn't realize how much of an improvement it actually is unless you went back and played one of those old games. To be able to do so seamlessly and intuitively should be commended, because nailing that feeling of muscle memory while improving upon it is a damn hard thing to nail, but Hollowbody has it in spades. Oh, fuck! Puzzles in Hollowbody are pretty solid as well. While a lot of them are just the age-old find item, use item trope that has been stuck with the survival horror genre since the 90s, there are a few instances of legit problem-solving puzzles strewn about Hollowbody's runtime. I won't spoil them, but my favorite in the game was one where you have to light certain candles at a church based on headstones. It's a neat concept, and it was well written enough that even though the act of running around to finding headstones to read is a bit lame, it still felt satisfying to figure out what was needed to piece the puzzle together. There are just enough of those types of puzzles that make the game flow better, and I liked a lot of them. The last big thing I want to cover is the game's atmosphere, which, like 9 times out of 10, is basically perfect. It nails a different tone and feel than a game like Silent Hill 1, 2, or 3, but it still clearly showcases Nate's love for those games by utilizing a bleak, desolate location, abandoned environments paired with a unique visual flair of cyberpunk in the game's UI and menu systems that give it its own identity. The apartment complex in particular is so on point that the first time playing through it, I genuinely felt like I was playing a new Silent Hill game. Its breathy OST filled my soul with that special ingredient that memories are born from. It's a hard tightrope to walk, balancing replicating your love for one thing while at the same time making that thing your own, but there's no denying that Nate accomplished this. But
You look like a good show.
Hollowbody's aesthetic, while pretty great, feels unfortunately a little half-baked. But that might just be a fault of its marketing. Hollowbody is always presented as a cyberpunk survival horror, but apart from the design of the menus and the occasional bit of UI that appears in the game, the only instance of the game feeling cyberpunk at all is right after that playable prologue during the intro cinematic. The rest of the game is exploring more traditional Silent Hill-styled survival horror locations that are, I guess, only held to a higher aesthetic standard of cyberpunk, but only barely. I do want to clarify that there's nothing wrong with this necessarily, but it does feel weird that the game is constantly referenced as a cyberpunk game, or that the cyberpunk aesthetic is really key to its identity.
A survival horror short story with a tech noir theme. Yeah, the best kind of noir.
One thing that I love just as much as a good old-fashioned survival horror title, it's one with a cyberpunk aesthetic.
Hollowbody feels as if Blade Runner 2049 and Silent Hill 3 had a baby which then grew up.
Like I said previously, this might just be a fault of the advertising or the marketing and not really the game's fault. But even if you aren't aware of the marketing, that little taste of a real cyberpunk setting shown to you at the beginning of the game is essentially robbed from you from the rest of the runtime. I would love to explore a cyberpunk-styled Silent Hill game. That would be amazing! But unfortunately, Hollowbody just toys with the idea and in my opinion is unfortunately a missed opportunity. Especially when you consider that, like I said previously, the atmosphere is really good, but only when you allow yourself to stew in it. I also said earlier that the apartment complex is the best location of the game, as it is, in my opinion, the most traditional survival horror location in Hollowbody, with light backtracking, needing several items to solve a sequence of several separate, if not mild, puzzles. And that's great, but the issue that I have with it is that it's only the first area of the game, and every segment after that is essentially either just one big open area or a small indoor segment that requires basically one puzzle per location that is solved, entirely self-contained. This makes the pacing of the game rapid fire and doesn't really allow me the time to appreciate its atmosphere as best as it can, because each segmented puzzle requires you essentially going to one end of the map, then roughly back again to the start, and then one more time back to the exit. It's a bit tiring by the end of the game, which, might I remind you, is pretty short. My biggest issue with this is that I'm just never in one place for long enough to actually vibe with its atmosphere. And sure, some segments are longer than others, and the trek through the sewers near the end of the game is probably the second best location in the game. But a big middle chunk of Hollowbody is just filled with average at best segments. Its rapid pace also makes it feel like a greatest hits of survival horror, which in its own way could be a positive, as Silent Hill 3 is basically a greatest hits of horror tropes laden with a Silent Hill paint job, but Silent Hill 3, at least in my opinion, is fucking terrifying, and its rapid pace of locations feels more like you're being pummeled by the devs, whereas Hollowbody feels pretty chill in comparison. I think that Hollowbody's biggest issue with this position is that it leads the game to feel more like an homage to survival horror rather than it being a real entry in its pantheon. Now, before I go into my last main issue with Hollowbody, I want to pop in and say that I don't want to sound like I'm hating on this game. Because like I said at the beginning of the video, I did enjoy it. There are plenty things to love about Hollowbody, even despite the issues that I have with it. It's a sweet slice of gaming history condensed into a new love letter to those old games that so many of us experienced growing up. That being said, the last main thing that I want to talk about regarding the bad of Hollowbody is the combat. Now, before anybody gets upset at me, I want to clarify that I know that combat in old school horror games was always clunky and unintuitive, and that was basically by design. I also want to clarify that I'm okay with that. I like those old games. And Hollowbody sticks to that design philosophy to a T, but in my opinion, makes a critical error in one aspect of its combat, specifically the melee combat. Melee combat in Hollowbody is damn near close to unusable, and it's because of one specific thing. There are several different attack animations that cycle through your repeated swings of your melee weapons, and all of them have different timings and drastically different ranges. And it's all randomized! This means that you'll be hitting an enemy close to you, potentially knock them back a little bit, and then you'll either do an attack that has the range to hit the enemy, or just miss them entirely, and it's not your fault. Oh shit! It feels less like, oh, it's a horror game, so you should have a hard time defending yourself, but more like, I have literally no way to actually work around its design other than to just hope and pray. And in my opinion, that's kinda lame. It doesn't break the game or anything, but it does break the melee combat entirely.
Dying for the right cause is the most human thing we can do.
Those are the highest praises and the harshest criticisms that I have towards Hollowbody. I think that all in all, the game's good, worth the price of admission, and definitely worthwhile to experience. While I don't think it earns its place among some of its contemporaries, it is a shining beacon of what one person can accomplish with the right passion for the genre, and it is at least a level to strive to clear, especially in the indie horror scene. Hollowbody is a great game with some flaws and some missed potential, but don't let that get in the way of the fact that this is just a good game. If a rating would help you understand where I'm coming from, I think Hollowbody is the quintessential 7.5 out of 10 that there ever was. Love your face, love your show. See you soon.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.